started with a text. "Hey, there's this party happening tomorrow night at the old Morrison house. Everyone's going. It'll be epic." It was from Ryan, my oldest friend and the king of impulsive plans. Normally, I'd pass on a last-minute invite to a supposedly haunted house, but something about the way he phrased it hooked me. Maybe it was his mention of everyone or my own lingering boredom. Either way, I found myself texting back, "I'm in. Who else is coming?" By the next evening, I stood outside the infamous Morrison house, a towering relic of faded grandeur. The place looked like it had been plucked from a horror movie. Shuttered windows, peeling paint, and an air of abandonment so thick it felt alive. Ryan was already there, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "About time, man," he said, his grin sharp against the dim glow of his phone. "You're gonna love this." Inside, the house was somehow worse. The air felt stale, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. A small crowd had gathered in the main hall, their laughter echoing eerily against the cracked walls. I recognized a few faces. Emma, with her quiet confidence, and Mike, who always seemed 2 drinks ahead of everyone else. They waved me over to a corner where a makeshift bar had been set up. "You ever hear the story of this place?" Emma asked, her voice low and conspiratorial. I shook my head, though I had 1,000 variations of it. Murdered family, restless spirits, cursed land. Every town has its Morrison house. "They say," Emma continued, "if you're here past midnight, you'll meet her." "Her who?" I asked, playing along. Ryan chimed in, his grin widening. "The lady in black. She's supposed to be some kind of ghost haunting anyone dumb enough to stick around." I laughed, but it came out hollow. The house didn't feel like it needed legends to make it terrifying. Something about the silence between the jokes and the way shadows clung to the corners of the room made my skin itch. Still, I stayed. We all did, as if the night itself had claimed us. Ryan had brought a Ouija board. "It's just for laughs," he said, plopping it onto the rickety coffee table in the middle of the room. I rolled my eyes. "Really? You couldn't just bring beer like a normal person?" But Ryan was determined. "Come on, it's perfect for this place. We'll all have a good laugh." Emma hesitated, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of her cup. "I don't know. That thing gives me the creeps." "It's just a game," Ryan said, winking at her. "Nothing happens unless you let it get to you." Against my better judgment, I joined them. The room grew quieter as more people gathered around, curiosity outweighing discomfort. The old house groaned under our weight, every creak and shuffle amplified in the stillness. Ryan set the planchette in the center of the board and placed his fingers on it. "All right, everyone, let's ask the spirits of the Morrison house to show themselves." Emma and I exchanged glances. "You're such an idiot," I muttered, but I put my fingers on the board anyway. The planchette began to move almost immediately. My first thought was that Ryan was pushing it, but his grin faded into something less confident. "Who's doing that?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual. "No one," Emma whispered. "Right?" It spelled out one word: go. The tension in the room thickened. "Okay, very funny," Mike said, standing up. "Who's messing with us?" No one admitted to it, and suddenly the game felt less amusing. I glanced at Emma, whose face had gone pale. "Let's stop," she said, her voice unsteady. But Ryan wasn't done. "No way," he said, gripping the planchette tighter. "Let's see where this goes." His bravado felt forced now, the kind of thing you do when you're more scared than you'll admit. We asked more questions, simple ones at first, but the answers didn't make sense. Random letters, nonsense words. It was easy to write it off as someone messing around until the board spelled something chillingly specific. "Look up." Everyone froze. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, as if on cue, the ancient chandelier above us groaned and swayed, the bolts holding it to the ceiling letting out an ominous creak. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice louder than I meant. "Relax," Ryan said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the ceiling. "It's just the wind or something." But when the chandelier dropped, it wasn't the wind. It smashed into the table, sending shards of glass and splinters flying. The room erupted into chaos as everyone scrambled back. The board was in pieces and Ryan was bleeding from a gash on his arm. "What the hell?" he yelled, clutching at his sleeve. The house seemed to groan in response, the sound deep and guttural, like it was alive and angry. No one wanted to admit it, but we all knew. Something was very wrong. The chandelier's crash left the air heavy with dust and fear. People were shouting, but it all felt muted to me, like I was underwater. Ryan's arm was dripping blood, and Emma was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering. I grabbed a towel from the kitchen and pressed it to Ryan's wound. "We're done here," I snapped, my voice shaking. "This is over." The others murmured in agreement, but no one moved. It was like the house itself was holding us there, the oppressive weight of its silence louder than our panicked breathing. "We need to call someone," Mike finally said. "Ryan needs stitches." "I left my phone in the car," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll go with you," I offered, desperate to escape the house, even if just for a moment. The two of us stepped outside, leaving the others to deal with the mess. The night was still, but not peaceful. It was suffocating. Every sound, from the crunch of gravel underfoot to the distant rustle of leaves, felt like a warning. Emma fumbled with her car door, finally yanking it open. She grabbed her phone and turned it on, but her face fell. No signal. "Of course," I muttered, glancing back at the house. Its dark silhouette loomed against the sky, each window like a black, unblinking eye. I hated it. "We'll drive down the road," Emma said, her voice shaky. We climbed into the car and Emma started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the winding dirt road. We hadn't gone far when a figure appeared in the beam. Emma slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop. My heart leapt into my throat as I stared at the person standing in the middle of the road. They didn't move. "Who the hell?" Emma began, but then the figure turned and stepped toward us. It was Ryan. "What the?" I whispered, turning in my seat to look back toward the house. Ryan couldn't be here. He was inside, injured and surrounded by the others. But there he was, or at least something that looked exactly like him. His face was blank, devoid of the cocky grin we all knew. He raised a hand, as if to wave us down, but the gesture was slow and unnatural, like a glitching video. Emma's breathing quickened. "What do we do?" I didn't answer. My hand hovered over the door handle, but instinct told me not to get out. The figure stood there for another moment, then abruptly turned and walked off into the trees. Emma didn't wait for me to speak. She floored the gas, the car lurching forward with a roar. "What was that?" she demanded, gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. "I don't know," I admitted. We reached the main road and finally got a signal. Emma dialed 911, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. The operator assured her that help was on the way, but it would take time to reach the isolated house. When we returned, the others were huddled on the porch. Ryan's face was pale and he was holding his makeshift bandage tightly. "What took you so long?" he snapped. Emma opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no point in explaining what we'd seen. The paramedics arrived an hour later, and while they stitched up Ryan's arm, a deputy questioned the rest of us. None of us mentioned the figure on the road or the strange feeling in the house. It all sounded too absurd, even if it was real. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, we decided to leave. The party was over, and no one wanted to stay in that house a second longer. But as we piled into our cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement in the upstairs window. When I turned to look, it was gone. We left the Morrison house that morning, vowing never to return, but deep down I knew the night wasn't over. It had followed us. It started like any ordinary weekend. A handful of friends, some cheap booze, and the promise of a party in a forgotten part of town. "You sure about this, man?" I asked, gripping the wheel of my aging Corolla. My buddy Jason sat in the passenger seat, tapping a cigarette against the open window frame, his expression unreadable in the flickering light of passing street lamps. "Trust me," he said, flicking the unlit cigarette into the glove box. "Mark swore this party would be one for the books. Some old mansion DJ's open bar, you don't say no to that." From the back seat, Eddie chimed in, "Dude, I heard there's this crazy room in the basement, like rituals or something. People don't even talk about it after." His laugh was sharp, but it didn't sit right with me. There was a weird energy to the night, one I couldn't quite place. Jason rolled his eyes. Eddie, you and your conspiracy theories, it's just a party. Relax. We pulled up to the address an hour later, deep in a part of town none of us recognized. The mansion stood like a sentinel against the backdrop of gnarled trees and a low, hanging mist. Lights flickered from the windows, and bass-heavy music vibrated through the thick oak doors. The place was alive, and yet something about it felt off. "All right, Nando," Jason said, throwing an arm around me as we climbed the cracked marble steps. "Let's see what this place has got." Inside, the air was electric. Crowds of people swirled around like shadows, their faces lit by strobe lights. The decor was ornate but decayed, with gold-trimmed mirrors cracked like spider webs and furniture that looked older than any of us. There was a strange mix of grandeur and abandonment that clung to the place, as though it had been waiting decades for this night. Eddie disappeared almost immediately, drawn to a group of costumed partygoers chanting around a fire pit in the courtyard. Jason headed for the makeshift bar, leaving me to wander. The deeper I moved into the house, the stranger things became. Conversations hushed as I passed, and guests gave me quick, nervous glances. One woman, her face pale and painted, leaned in close and whispered, "Don't go to the basement." Then she vanished into the crowd. When I found Jason again, he was talking to a tall, thin man in a black suit. The man smiled at me, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "So you're the storyteller," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I've heard about you." Jason clapped me on the shoulder. "He's messing with you, Nando. Come on, let's grab Eddie and check out that basement. What's a little adventure, huh?" I hesitated, the woman's warning still echoing in my head. Maybe we shouldn't. But Jason was already pulling me along, his laughter lost in the swelling noise of the crowd. Jason, Eddie, and I stood at the top of the grand staircase that led to the basement. The air here was heavier, like the place itself was holding its breath. The music and chatter from the party above faded into the background, replaced by a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the walls. "This is a bad idea," I muttered, but Jason shrugged me off. "Bad ideas are the best ideas," he said, gripping the wooden railing. "Besides, how often do you get to explore a creepy old mansion?" Eddie was already ahead of us, his phone flashlight flickering as he disappeared into the dark. The basement wasn't what I expected. No cobwebs or chains or musty old boxes. Instead, the walls were smooth concrete, and the space was eerily clean. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the floor. It looked like someone had tried to modernize it but gave up halfway. The hum was louder down here, and it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from a steel door at the far end of the room. Eddie stopped in front of it, grinning like he'd just found buried treasure. "Check it out," he said, running his hand over the door. There was a keypad next to it, and a faint red light blinked steadily above the handle. "What do you think's in there?" "Nothing we need to find out," I said quickly. My voice sounded too loud in the empty space. Jason smirked and pulled out a bobby pin from his pocket. "Come on, Nando. It's probably just a wine cellar or something." He crouched by the keypad, fiddling with it like he'd done this 100 times before. "Jason, don't," I snapped, but Eddie was already egging him on. It didn't take long for Jason to crack it. The red light turned green with a faint beep, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with metal cages. Each one was empty, but there were strange stains on the floor, dark and uneven, like something had been dragged across the concrete. Eddie's grin faltered. "What the hell is this?" Jason stepped inside, shining his phone flashlight around. "Probably some kind of storage. Relax, it's just..." His voice cut off as he stared into one of the cages. "Wait, is that... hair?" I followed his gaze and saw it too. Long dark strands clinging to the bars, tangled like someone had tried to claw their way out. My stomach churned. This wasn't just storage. "We need to leave," I said firmly. Eddie laughed nervously. "Dude, don't be dramatic, it's just..." He stopped mid-sentence, his flashlight catching something on the far wall. A smear of letters written in a dark, dried substance. "Leave now." Jason froze. "Okay, maybe he's right, let's..." The hum grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a vibration, running through the floor and up my legs. A muffled thud echoed from deeper in the hallway. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. "Eddie!" Jason hissed, grabbing his arm. "We're done! Let's go!" But Eddie wasn't listening. His flashlight was trained on another door at the end of the hallway. This one marked with a rusted sign, "Authorized personnel only." He took a step toward it, and then another, like he was drawn to it. "Eddie!" I shouted, but my voice only made him move faster. The door groaned open, and for a moment none of us moved. Then from inside came a sound that made my blood run cold, the unmistakable clink of chains, followed by a low, guttural growl. Eddie slammed the door shut and ran back toward us, his face pale. "We're leaving. Now." We didn't argue. Whatever was behind that door wasn't something we wanted to meet. As we scrambled up the stairs, the lights in the basement flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness. We burst out of the basement, panting and shaken, back into the chaos of the party. But the mansion didn't feel the same. The music had shifted to something darker, slower. The crowd was thinner now, faces harder to recognize. It wasn't until we reached the courtyard that we realized Eddie was missing. "Where is he?" I asked, trying to keep the edge of panic out of my voice. Jason scanned the crowd, his face tense. "He was right behind us," Jason snapped. He pushed through the throngs of people, yelling Eddie's name. The guests barely seemed to notice, their eyes glazed over as if in a trance. Something was deeply wrong, but I couldn't put it into words. "Jason," I said, grabbing his arm. "We need to leave, now. Eddie knows the way out. He'll find us." Jason shook his head. "We don't leave him behind. You go if you're scared, but I'm not abandoning my friend." His voice cracked at the end, and I realized he wasn't angry. He was terrified. I didn't leave. Instead, I followed him back into the house, weaving through the strange, silent crowd. The mansion seemed to shift as we moved, corridors stretching into impossible angles. Every door we opened led to another hallway, another dead end. My pulse pounded in my ears. Finally, we found Eddie in a small sitting room near the back of the mansion. He was slumped on a velvet couch, his phone clutched in one hand. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring at nothing. "Eddie!" Jason yelled, shaking him. "What's wrong with you?" Eddie blinked slowly, like waking from a nightmare. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "They're watching us." Jason and I exchanged a look. "Who's watching us?" I asked, but Eddie just shook his head, muttering under his breath. I grabbed his phone from his hand, hoping for a clue. The screen was cracked, but the last thing he'd recorded was still playing. It was a video from the basement, a shaky, grainy clip of him opening that second door. For a moment, the screen was blank. Then came a flash of movement, a figure darting across the frame, too fast to make out. The sound of chains followed, loud and sharp, and then a voice, low and guttural. "You don't belong here." I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling. "We're leaving, right now." Jason didn't argue. He hauled Eddie to his feet, and we made our way to the front door, avoiding the crowd as much as possible. But when we reached the exit, the massive oak doors wouldn't budge. "They were open earlier," Jason said, shoving his shoulder against them. The hum from the basement was back, louder now, and I realized it was coming from all around us. The walls seemed to vibrate, and the lights flickered violently. "We'll find another way out," I said, pulling Eddie along. But every door, every window was locked. The house wasn't letting us leave. Jason stopped suddenly, pointing to a side door near the kitchen. "There," he said. We ran for it, and by some miracle, it opened. Outside, the air was freezing, the trees casting jagged shadows under a pale moon. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the street, the mansion looming behind us like a dark sentinel. Eddie stumbled and collapsed onto the curb, gasping for air. "Never again," Jason said, his voice shaking. "I don't care who throws the party, never again." I nodded, my hands still trembling, but as I looked back at the mansion, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The house had let us leave, but it had taken something from us, something we might never get back. It started with an invitation, a plain white card slipped under my apartment door. The handwriting was neat but strangely cold, like it was mimicking sincerity. It read, "You're cordially invited to a party at Blackwood Hall, midnight sharp. Don't be late." No sender, no RSVP, Just those chilling instructions. I should have tossed it, but curiosity snagged me. There's something about an unmarked envelope that pokes at the mind like a splinter. I stood outside Blackwood Hall, the building a grotesque relic of the 19th century. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, almost choking the gargoyles perched on the edges. The place felt alive, its many windows like dark eyes watching me approach. I didn't want to go inside, but here I was. "What's the worst that could happen?" I muttered, the words tasting hollow even as they left my lips. Inside, the air was heavy with an oppressive stillness. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by weak beams from an old chandelier. The only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my boots. The foyer opened to a grand staircase that twisted upward like a coiled serpent. A single candle flickered at the top as if beckoning me further. Against every instinct screaming to leave, I stepped inside. "You're late," a voice said behind me. I turned sharply to see a woman in a deep red dress. Her face was sharp, eyes too bright for the dim room. "Everyone's waiting for you upstairs," she said, smiling like she knew a secret. Before I could ask who she was, she walked away, her heels clicking in perfect rhythm. I hesitated, gripping the banister as I climbed. Each step felt heavier than the last, the candlelight above warping the shadows around me. At the top, the hallway stretched impossibly long, doors lining either side like teeth in a gaping maw. One door stood slightly ajar, light seeping through. "All right," I whispered to myself, steadying my breath. "Let's see who sent the invitation." The door creaked as I nudged it open, revealing a dimly lit room crowded with faces. About a dozen people stood scattered, some in conversation, others watching the doorway like they had been waiting for me. Their expressions were neutral, too neutral, as though they were suppressing something. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped forward. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth but practiced, like a salesman closing a deal. "We've been expecting you." I glanced around, searching for answers. "What is this?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "A party," the man replied, his grin a little too perfect. "But not the kind you're used to. It's a gathering for those willing to play a game. You've already accepted the invitation by stepping inside. Now, you're one of us." The room shifted, the air thick with unspoken tension. I noticed a young woman near the corner, her hands trembling as she gripped a glass of wine. She avoided my gaze, but her lips moved as if whispering a prayer. Across the room, an older man was staring at the floor, his knuckles white as he clutched the arm of a chair. Something was very wrong here. "What kind of game?" I asked, my voice low. The man's smile faltered, but only for a second. "A test of resolve, a test of honesty." He gestured to a table in the center of the room where a small box rested. "We each draw a card from the box. Some cards are blank, others are not. Those who draw a marked card must complete a task. Refuse and the consequences are severe." I stared at the box, my gut knotting tighter with every word. "And if I walk out that door right now?" The man's smile returned, colder this time. "You're free to leave, but once the invitation is accepted, it follows you. It's best to play the game." My fingers twitched. The room felt like it was closing in, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint sound of something shifting in the walls. A scratching, faint but deliberate. No one else seemed to react, their focus locked on me. "Fine," I said, stepping forward. The room watched in collective silence as I reached into the box. My fingers brushed against paper, and I pulled out a card. It was blank. Relief washed over me, but only briefly. "Now," the man said, addressing the room. "Who's next?" The young woman in the corner shook her head violently. "No, I can't." Her voice cracked, and she stumbled back, nearly dropping her glass. "You know the rules," the man said coldly. He motioned to two others who grabbed her by the arms. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound as they dragged her to the center of the room. "No!" she cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't sign up for this!" "You did the moment you entered," the man said flatly. He gestured to the box. "Draw." Her trembling hand reached into the box, pulling out a card. This one was marked with a red X. Her face crumpled as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Please don't make me do this," she begged. The man leaned closer, his tone dripping with menace. The rules are the rules." The silence was suffocating as he handed her a slip of paper detailing her task. Her hands shook as she read it aloud. "Go into the basement and bring back the red lantern." I had no idea what the basement held, but the color drained from her face as if she did. Without another word, she was dragged out of the room. The rest of us stood frozen, listening to her cries fade into the distance. The man turned back to us, his smile returning. "Now then," he said, as though nothing had happened. "Shall we continue?" The room froze, all eyes locked on the middle-aged man the host had chosen. His pale complexion grew paler and his lips moved silently as though rehearsing an excuse. But no words came. His body betrayed him with a trembling step forward. "Excellent," the host purred, gesturing toward the ominous box in the center of the room. "Draw." The man hesitated, sweat glistening on his brow. His hand hovered over the box like it might bite. Finally, with a shuddering breath, he plunged his hand in and pulled out a card. His face collapsed with relief. It was blank. "Lucky," the host said, his grin tight. "Back to your place." The man stumbled backward, retreating into the crowd, but the atmosphere was no less oppressive. My own chest felt like it was caught in a vice. I could hear the faint creaking of floorboards in the distance. The young woman must still be in the basement. Every second stretched unbearably long, her cries echoing in my mind. "Well?" The host clapped his hands, cutting through the silence. "Who's next?" His gaze scanned the room, hungry for his next victim. This time, he didn't wait for volunteers. His eyes landed on a frail-looking man in a shabby suit, and with a sharp nod, summoned him forward. The man shook his head, muttering, "Please, I can't." But the crowd pressed against him, the unspoken rule of compliance forcing his feet forward. His hand trembled violently as he reached into the box. A red X. The color drained from his face, his knees buckling slightly. "Ah," the host murmured, his tone almost pitying. "Unfortunate. Let's see your task." He unfolded a slip of paper and handed it to the man, who read it with a trembling voice. "Take the mirror from the study and shatter it." Gasps rippled through the room. Whatever the task meant, it was significant. The man's wide, fearful eyes searched for mercy, but the host's smile only sharpened. "You know what happens if you refuse." The frail man swallowed hard and nodded, dragging his feet toward the door as though marching to his doom. I watched him disappear into the hallway, my own fear growing sharper with each passing moment. The silence grew heavier, broken only by the faint scratch of something moving within the walls. I glanced at the others, hoping for answers in their faces, but they were like statues, carefully blank. What had I stumbled into? And what was waiting in that basement? The host turned his attention to me. "You've been awfully quiet," he said, his voice smooth but charged with menace. "Would you like another turn?" "No," I said, the word sharper than I intended. My voice drew attention, head swiveling toward me. I realized my mistake immediately. Resistance seemed to make me a target. I softened my tone. "I've already drawn. I followed the rules." The host tilted his head, studying me. "Fair enough, for now." The words hung in the air like a threat. I gripped the edge of a nearby chair, trying to steady myself. My eyes wandered to the door, the instinct to flee screaming in my mind. But where would I go? The host's words echoed in my ears. "Once the invitation is accepted, it follows you." A sudden crash reverberated through the hall, cutting through my spiraling thoughts. It was distant but unmistakable, the sound of breaking glass. The frail man had completed his task. But what now? My heart pounded as I waited, half expecting something terrible to happen. The host chuckled softly, a sound that grated against the room's tension. "One step closer to freedom," he said cryptically. "Now we wait for her." Her. The woman who had been sent to the basement. As if summoned by the mention of her, a low groan crept up from beneath us. It wasn't human. It sounded like wood straining under immense pressure. The air in the room shifted, growing colder, and I swore I saw my breath fog in the dim light. Others noticed too, their eyes darting to the floor as if expecting it to collapse. The door to the hall slammed open and the young woman stumbled back inside. Her face was a mask of horror, her hands clutching a small, flickering red lantern. She was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaking her face as she fell to her knees. The lantern's glow cast strange, writhing shadows on the walls. The host clapped slowly, his grin widening. "Well done. Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please don't make me go back." "You won't have to," he assured her, though his tone carried no comfort. He approached her and carefully took the lantern from her hands. "You've completed your task." She nodded weakly, collapsing into quiet sobs as two others helped her to her feet. I stared at the lantern in the host's hands, the flickering light inside strangely hypnotic. It seemed alive. "What is this?" I blurted out, unable to contain myself. "What kind of game are you playing?" The host turned to me, his eyes glinting with something ancient and cruel. "It's not a game," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that still carried through the room. "It's a ritual, one we've all been chosen to complete." "Why me?" I asked, my voice shaking. He stepped closer, his smile a cold slash across his face. "Because you answered the call, and now you're bound to see it through." The lantern's light flared briefly, casting grotesque shapes across the room. And for the first time, I felt it. The undeniable sense that something was watching us from beyond.